You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Trina Clayeux. She's a CEO of Give an Hour. It's an interesting approach to mental health. I'm not going to spoil it. We'll hear it from her. But welcome, Trina. Thanks for coming.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, let's start out with your background. Why mental health? You know, what's hopefully terrible things didn't happen to you in your past, but why this area?
I think I've always been drawn into professions that were about helping others. And while not all of them were specifically just looking at mental health, they all really had an underpinning of not being able to get like kind of good, customized or tailored mental health that really addressed what people were wanting and looking for. And so as my career progressed, mental health actually became just a really natural focus, and I think I recognized that it's so critical in every aspect of our lives. And so being able to be with an organization and in a role where we can reduce those barriers to mental health and bring something that's more accessible to people we just felt almost like a calling. And so that's how I ended up here.
You know, the old saying, if you don't have your health, you don't have anything. And I thought about that separately from mental health. If if the people around you, their mental health's not good, it's just as bad as if physically they were disabled, because nothing can work.
Absolutely. Clearly we've recognized that, I think in the last 5 years, but even, prior to that. But I think what we're seeing now is just such a culmination of really not understanding or neglecting or putting aside that importance that you're speaking about mental health. And if you don't have it, it is really difficult to have other successes or other things going well in your life. So it really is something that we have to pay just as much attention to as our physical health.
How long have you been in the field and what role have you played in your career so far?
Yeah, so most of my experience, it's hard for me to even say anymore, but, I'm about 35 years into just, the progression of a career that always started in really that helping profession. And so I've been in a lot of different roles over the years, most of them just progressed. But it's always been in areas of like education or workforce development, or even spent several years in supporting like correctional institutions. And a couple of roles before this one, I really think I saw it. I just saw it different. And I was working in workforce development and education for young adults, so that 18 to 24, 26-year-old young adult, and really started to address. There were so many issues and challenges coming out that were underpinned by mental health. And there were so few resources, or it was so difficult to access care. And the care that was being offered did not match what the needs are of the young adults that we were serving. And so then I started kind of working around the system and like, how do we get what we want and need? How do we grow our own? How do we educate ourselves? How do we find people who are the trusted, adults in these young adults' lives that can do these things? And so when this role came open, which I've been here as CEO for 3 years now, it was just such an interesting time and way to approach this crisis. A crisis of not having nearly enough professionals. We only have one mental health professional for every 350 people. Half of the country is in a mental health professional shortage. It seems like such a big challenge, but yet there are so many great organizations and so many people who are in this field who are trying to do something. And I think that's how I saw where we were positioned, is that we actually had the ability to really go to people and find out what they wanted and needed and curate what they want to need in a way that they want to need it. And so it became really kind of that bottom up, but very personal touch to getting people into the type of mental health care, whether it's clinical, non-clinical care, self-directed. There's so many options. And I think that that's part of been our history, is like really educating people about feeling empowered to get the kind of mental health care that they need.
What does this mean? Like, what is the Give an Hour concept? What do you guys do differently?
Yeah. So we have several options for people who do come to us, but our history was, at least the first 10 years, we were a clinical match organization. So we're a nonprofit that leaned into this incredible expertise of mental health professionals who, quote, gave an hour, so our name, Give an Hour, of free mental health care. And at that time, it was in direct response to 9/11. It was for military veterans and loved ones. It was no cost, it was barrier-free, and it was really about matching people to clinical care. And we still continue that part of our model. I think it's an incredibly important part. It's evolved over time where we pour just as much back into our mental health professionals. And so we do their training and continuing education and networking and peer support, and are really trying to make sure that people feel connected in this field. So hopefully they don't leave, but also when people are coming into the field, that they have a place to land and a place that they can find community and support. And so we've always done the clinical matching. And then we really started thinking that this is such a great model for other people, that goes beyond the military experience. But there's also crisis looming at that time in like 2015, 2016, where it was like, God, there's just not enough mental health professionals to meet the need. And so how do you add to that? And so we did a large national public service campaign, really successful. It called the Campaign to Change Direction, which was really about changing that conversation about mental health and addressing stigma that was holding so many people back and continues to from getting and accessing mental health care.
I don't know. What do you mean the stigma of just talking to a counselor or?
Yeah, even just acknowledging, beyond, mental health, even just the word has such a connotation to it. It's like, oh my gosh, mental health. It seems like it has to be kind of heavier or even negative, where, we all have mental health. It's neutral, but it comes very charged. And so when we have worked with the military veteran and loved one community, especially in 2005, when we started the stigma was so incredibly prevalent. And it was, you don't want people to know that you're struggling. You don't want someone to know that you're seeing a therapist or that you think to. You don't want to acknowledge that you may need some additional support. And so I always think it kind of shape shifts. Like, it shows up different in different communities. You may have communities of color where mental health is a pretty taboo conversation, and getting therapy isn't easily accessible, nor is it sought after a lot. And so when you have communities of color who are doing that, they're really breaking through a lot of social and cultural stigma. Military would be a great one, where the stigma has changed, but it continues to be there, where you don't want people to necessarily know. And while some great leaders in the military have come out and talked about their own mental health struggles or the fact that they go to a therapist, many times I hear a soldier say, well, yeah, of course you do. You're the command sergeant major, or you've been deployed, or you have all this responsibility, but I haven't done that. So there's almost like a feeling I haven't earned the right to get mental health care. And so I think that's why it's like such a whack-a-mole. It's so difficult to tamp down because it will come back up, and sometimes it just changes. So while the mental health conversation now has broken through some stigma for sure, the conversation we've had in the last 5 years is leaps and bounds where it's ever been. It still continues to be there, and it continues to be one of the biggest barriers from people getting help.
All right. So what is the give an hour concept? Is that someone giving an hour of their time to help somebody, or someone needs to give themselves an hour a week?
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. We love when people interpret it different ways. But yes, we continue to do that clinical matching and really working at getting that clinical hour out there, which again becomes that access to care, which is such an important piece of this. But I think that adding to it, which is what we've done, which is we also have options and opportunities for peer support. So those are those individuals who have a lived experience, who want to use their lived experience with mental health to help others. And in turn, it helps them. And so it's a reciprocal model called trauma-informed peer support. And so it's a non-clinical way of being able to really support that mental health professional in a different way by adding more people to the mix of how we can access care, and really professionalizing what peer supporters bring to one another, to their community, to their friends, to their families, to other people who've suffered. And I could give like a quick example of what that looks like, but in 2017 through about 2017, when there was the Route 91 Harvest Festival shooting in Las Vegas, much of that response went to Vegas, which totally makes sense. It's a place-based. It happened during the festival. But more than 60% of the people who were attending that festival were from Southern California. So the next day, many people left Vegas and went back home and went across 8 counties in Southern California and just went back to work or went back to school or went back into their lives and weren't connected to all the support and resources that were going on in Vegas. And so several years later, we were afforded the opportunity to go into Southern California and work with people who've been impacted. And I think one of the great things that we did was that we really tried to get close to a community and support them the way that they wanted and needed. But we didn't have peer supporters. We didn't have the access to people who had been in a tragic, that had the most deaths out of any shooting to that time. And so it was on such a large scale, and it was like finding therapists who have had those experiences. I mean, we have trauma-informed therapists and it's fantastic, but this was on such a different level. And so what we see now is like if you could go into a community that had been harmed like that and bring a variety of supports that people can then choose. They can choose to lean into peer support. They can choose to find a therapist. They can choose a community that feels informed. They could do self-directed learning. And those are really the evolution that I feel like we're on now, which is to allow or enable people to come to us and really choose what they think is right for them. And if they need additional support identifying that, that's also what we're here for, to really help educate people about what's the difference between this or this.
So what does it look like, the support or the sessions, versus, doing it by, by Zoom or doing it in the office? You come in, sit on the couch, talk to the person, cry into the tissue box, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And I think that's how many people think that therapy, even if you just think of clinical, works. And I think there's so much more empowerment involved in it. And so I think you're always looking for the right fit. So if I'm just thinking clinical care, it's like trying to find somebody who's the right fit. And for many people, even if they have a pressing reason or situation that got them to take that step to get into care with a therapist, they may not be willing, reveal that in the first, second, third session. There's a lot of trust and vulnerability. And I'll go back to stigma that's involved in like, is someone going to make me cry? Do I have to be, so ultra vulnerable when I'm there? And I think that, part of it is we're trying to help people understand that you get to choose how you show up. You get to choose what you're talking about, what you reveal, and then you're really trying to get that connection point with your therapist. And so that is one avenue for folks, is to get that clinical care, which can be in person, it can be Zoom. It just really depends on what people's wants and needs are. We do find a lot more people are more comfortable with telemedicine or Zoom or a variation of that. And then peer support, I think, is, again, just such an extension of opportunity where you, for our instance, you may come into a virtual group of people who have lived experience. So if you were someone who is in a peer support group for veterans, you would come into a group, you would have a veteran who actually facilitates, who's been trained to facilitate, who's elected to learn more about how to do peer facilitation and peer engagement. And they're really the ones to keep the group moving and connected. And I may come into that group and think, God, I'm not really even sure what I'm looking for. Like, I know I need something, and I'm looking for people who really understand the experience like I do. And so you can step in a group where you have immediately that kind of brother sisterhood or that camaraderie or that connection of somebody who is like, yeah, I've had that happen, or I get what you're saying, or tell me more. Like, that's not been my experience, but I'd love to hear more of yours. And it's so incredibly healing. It is absolutely powerful. The research says it's powerful. And if you've ever been in a peer group, you can absolutely see how powerful it is. And so for some people, that is a more comfortable place to be. They're like, I don't want to see a therapist. I don't want to do that one-to-one. I want to go in and I just really want to understand and find people who get me and can affirm something that I've been through. And then there's self-directed learning, which I think is, a complement to anything that people are doing, which is I just want to know more about like, what else can I do to manage anxious feelings, or what can I do to help sleep better, and what are some strategies for that? I mean, those are things that each of us can do to find, what works for us.
Well, what are the most common problems that, you're hearing recently, maybe the past year or so? How has it changed and what are they right now?
Yeah. Well, I would say, one way that we know it's changed is just the amount of sessions that people generally use. And so I would say pre-pandemic, since that's a big of a kind of a demarcation for a lot of us now, it was about 3 to 4 sessions that somebody would go see a clinical match with us. And now our average is 11. And so that could tell you a few things. It could tell you that people are just requiring more care. It could tell you that people are coming with a variety, maybe not just an isolated or what am I trying to say? An issue that is just like one thing that they want to bring, but maybe they're bringing a multitude of things, that they're looking for more connection and time to trust and build relationship with their therapist. And so I think that one of the things that is just helpful to know too, because a little bit of it is part of the access to care is getting people care and not putting a time limit on that care. I really believe that has to be between that therapist and that client, or that has to be part of that peer support conversation and can't be directed externally, which I know, in many circumstances it is. You get 5 sessions through insurance, or you get something through your employee assistance program, which is all great, but everybody has a different need. But what I find is that people are coming from a lot of stress intolerance. And so some of it is like day to day, just like stressors over time. There's a big feeling of what people describe as like anxiety, that there seems like there's not been a respite in a lot of external things happening, so there's economic anxiety, there's political anxiety, there's challenges around relationships, there's challenges around work. It feels daunting. I think that's what we're finding. And our skill sets and our practices aren't as aligned with addressing these big, bolder stressors. And so people are looking for solutions, or they're looking for just to release the pressure. It's like a pressure valve, and just open up the pressure valve a bit, and really looking for, what can I do? What is in my control when things feel like they're not? I would say across the country, and the research shows, it's all generally depression, anxiety, traumatic stress are some of the biggest, ongoing trends that people are coming for.
What's changed over the couple of years that you're seeing this, you think?
I think between the magnitude of challenges and the consistency of it, and like I said, there hasn't felt like a respite for a long time, where we haven't gone from, these tragedies that we end up seeing a lot of, on media, or where there's just seems like an onslaught, and there hasn't been a time to like really get our feet underneath us. And I feel like the pandemic is kind of the microcosm of that, where we had this collective experience and it just hasn't seemed like a slowdown from there. So you have a lot of things that come out that feel like, again, that they're out of our control, but then we also have so many things that are in our day to day that also feel like maybe it's just compounding. And so I think, and the mental health conversation has gotten kind of squishy, where we talk in big terms, like kind of diagnostic terms, anxiety, depression. That's why I'm trying to be careful about just saying like symptoms or feelings of anxiety, because we get really concrete sometimes when we're just talking about anxiety, but we're not talking about practices or really our empowerment. What can we do? How can we build a community of support? How do you access care? How do you find people who have a similar experience? How do you learn more and put something into practice? So it really focuses a lot on that empowerment aspect of it. And I'm hoping that that's kind of the churn that we're making with having so much attention on mental health and so much of it being a little bit more embedded in work and school and in life, that we're also bringing the practicality of like, what can we control? What can we do for each of us? And then how can you show up for others without, again, burning yourself out? But how do you express real empathy for things that other people are going through? And I do find that the majority of calls that I have, no matter what they are, if you push a little, if you just scratch the surface a little bit more, you will find that people are feeling exhausted. They're feeling overwhelmed. And they're feeling like things aren't totally in their control. And that's what I love about what we get to do, is like really bring those things together where people can find a community, but they can also find good practices that align with their life, with how they want to show up.
I don't know. It just doesn't seem really specific? Like what are some examples of what you guys have been able to do where someone couldn't get that anywhere else? They were happy with it.
Yeah, I mean, I could easily had a veteran reach out who wasn't feeling successful in getting care where through the avenues that he had available to him. And so he reached out and just said, like, if I don't get care this time, I'm done. Like, I don't know where else I'm going to go. And so we did a warm reach out. So Ashley Keaton is one of our individuals who will reach out and really make that human connection and let people know, like, we're going to work on your behalf to try to get you the kind of care that you're looking for. So asking some of those questions, finding out what the pressing challenges are, what are they looking for? And so in this particular case, this person was looking for clinical care. So looking for a therapist, great. What state are you in? Are you looking for in-person? Are you looking for virtual? Do you want a male or a female? Do you have a preference in, do they need to have served in the military before? So we're like really getting specific on what would be a good fit for you. And then her job will be to look for those therapists and have those conversations about, we have someone here who's looking for care. This is what they're looking for. Does this seem like a good match? And so all that's not on the person, the veteran who's called in is not doing all that. We're the ones who are vetting through the process. And then let's say she makes a match, then puts those two individuals together and then makes sure that an appointment has been scheduled and then does follow up to make sure that there was a connection. They went to their appointment and then to find out, are they satisfied? Does this feel like a good fit? What other supports might you need? Do you want to go into a peer support? We have a veteran peer support that is weekly. If you want to come into that, we'd be happy to get you connected. Are there things that you're dealing with that we could help you? Like, are you having sleep issues? We have some psychoeducation materials that we could send over to you and talk you through. So it's really that personal touch. And then that individual actually had his wife come, who was also a veteran, and they went to separate. And we got an email from her later to say that I didn't even think our marriage was going to make it. And now I have hope that it's going to, because we both are working on ourselves alone. But then we also have a marriage and family therapist we're working together with. And so, those are times where you hear people feel desperate, and they feel desperate to find something that's a good match and find somebody who can help make those things happen.
Is this accomplished mostly through telemedicine, or do you have a lot of in-person type events? Do you have locations in multiple cities?
Yeah, so we have therapists in all 50 states in Puerto Rico. And I will say the majority of people are asking for telehealth. And I'm sure a lot of it is around just the flexibility and the convenience of it. But they can, if they're looking for an in-person, then we will do our best to try to find someone who has some in-person appointments. Just given, like I said, with one therapist for every 350 people, that's, you got to just work really hard to try to find people who are going to be close in your proximity. And with half the country in a workplace shortage, sometimes you do have to go further out. So we work really hard to just match what the person's looking for, but also understanding if you're living in rural Texas, there may not be any therapist in a 50-mile radius. And so we do have to go a little bit further out. But then we also can offer the peer support option for something to do in between those sessions where you have a community put together. So I think the overall is that we're really looking at what does individualized mental health care look like? Because the system, the big mental health system does require it to work and function a certain way. And what we find is that there are groups of people who've had experiences that isn't working for. And so how can we be a good option for them?
So where do you serve people in person and where do you serve people online? Someone listening, where can they go?
Yeah, like I said, it's really going to depend on what they're looking for. And so if it's peer support, our peer supports right now are virtual. Our last in-person was before the pandemic, and that was in Southern California with the mass shooting event there in Las Vegas. We have place-based projects in different parts of the country. So in DC, as an example, we have a really interesting project there where we work with the mayor's office to offer clinical and non-clinical care to survivors of interpersonal violence. So people who've been part of the justice system, where we get referrals from, individuals who are working with them, and we work to connect them to the kind of care that they want and need. And so that, again, sometimes that might be virtual if that's what is working between the survivor and the clinician or the peer support group. But we really try to make it customizable depending on what their needs are. So if there was a group of people who were looking for an in-person virtual or in-person support group, then we would work to do that. But for the most part, in cases like that, a lot of times people are looking for virtual again. We have work in Maryland where we're working with returning citizens, and that's a play space right now where they're job seekers who are coming in, and we're working to support mental health both clinically and through peer support. And so, but some of those conversations may move to virtual depending what people want and need, but we're starting with play space where people come in to the employment office looking for jobs, but also can get mental health support and really putting in the context of your job seeking experience and incarceration, and then also getting into the workplace. So it's really, like I said, it's very tailored, especially when you have a national footprint. You've got people who have, varying needs across the country. And so you're really trying to work with them based on what they're presenting as what their wants and their needs are. And then what do we have available to help them?
All right. So a central point for listeners to go to start their journey with you guys, what would it be?
Yeah. So our website is giveanhour.org, and it really takes you on a journey. And so for individuals who are like in a population base, so as I said, veterans, military members, and loved ones, there's a little special spot for them to go, and they can put in an inquiry for what they're looking for. We serve other communities, as I said, individuals been affected by mass violence, also again has their own tab in community. We work in rare disease, so working with patients and loved ones whose families or children and families have a rare disease. And then as I mentioned, the interpersonal violence and then fraud, actually a fraud group who've been victimized by financial fraud. And so those individuals, each of them have their own area and own group. So that would be the first one. You go on, it's very simple to see. You click on what resonates, and it'll take you to a place to do a very quick inquiry. And then someone will reach out and then start that process.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and for doing this for people, because, the statistics are this dire. Every other person needs to be a therapist in order to help everybody. It's crazy.
Yeah, there's a lot. And unfortunately, there's a lot happening to build up that mental health capacity, but it will never reach the need. And so that's what I love is about being part of kind of an innovative way of thinking about and serving people.
Excellent.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.